Former minister and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society. From messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted throughout our culture, Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him are groundbreaking artist and podcaster Jacqueline Clare, whose focus on spiritual realism is summarized by the quote, "When we don't take the high road with our choices and miss the opportunity to develop spiritual qualities, we literally forfeit the purpose of our lives."
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Created in the Image of God. We are very excited today to have a very special guest who I'm just going to have jump into the studio right now. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
I met Jason actually online on Facebook after seeing some amazing images that he had taken of snowflakes, of all things. Jason is a Colorado born and raised, quote, storm doctor. He's the father of three, a physician, and an associate professor of medicine at the University of Colorado Hospital. Photography is his passion, not his profession, but he is making waves. We'll discuss the intersection of his art and work today and dip a toe into his opinions on recent events in the medical field, which will be of interest to many, inviting him to share his perspectives on how science, technology, and art are helping us to study and perceive the natural world and our society and maybe our species in new and different ways. So welcome, Jason, to the show tonight.
Wade, it's great to be on. It's great to chat with you.
So you agreed to be on the show after a random meeting with a stranger. You know, we tell our kids, we've both got kids, don't talk to strangers, but here you are after I reached out to you on Facebook.
That's right.
Did you have any concerns when you saw the topics for tonight, which we'll get into a little bit later, or are you looking forward to the discussion tonight?
Oh, I'm looking forward to it, definitely.
Awesome.
And yeah, I think that this issue of spirituality and science is right up my alley.
Wonderful. So as our regular viewers know, we're a firm believer in the essential unity of religion and science. And on this show, we're trying to get really a dialogue going between peoples of different opinions, you know, to sort of break through some of those echo chambers that reinforce our beliefs, not to necessarily try to, you know, force change anyone's beliefs, but rather open all of us up to those hermetically sealed belief systems that may keep us trapped in bad ideas, even superstitious beliefs or ignorant beliefs. And the kind of discussion that we're hoping to have tonight will hopefully bring some of those, you know, divided sides on a variety of issues closer together. So one thing that we like to do in order to accomplish that is really get to know our guests so we can know where that guest is coming from. And I find that the best way to do that is to ask some questions about your origin story, right? This show title is Created in the Image of God. It evokes the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and the origin story, the creation story. What is the creation story of Jason Persoff? Where do you come from in those early moments of your life and years, those childhood years that were formative?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Aurora, Colorado, and you know, I was raised in a Jewish family, but Judaism didn't capture for me the spirituality that I desperately longed for. For that, I had to really travel down some harsh roads and really hit a personal spiritual rock bottom about a decade ago, and was very blessed by the fact that God spoke to me in science, and it was an amazing moment where God put the word momentum in my mind. And all I could see is the entire universe and all of the molecules in it had all their own momentum. And here I am trying to swim upstream. And so,
Wow.
so that was the right word at the right time to communicate with me. And it changed my life.
That's amazing. And I had no idea. For our guests, I'm like gobsmacked right now at the coincidence of our meeting. So now, Jacqueline, I'm going to take a couple of extra minutes. in this opening segment, which is normally scheduled for 6 to 8 minutes. I'm going to probably go 10 now. And I apologize to you and to her topics, but I got to dive into this from a couple of perspectives. So the first one is the Jewish aspect, because what you don't know about me is I've written a trilogy. My first book is called The People of the Sign, SIGN. That sign is the seventh day Sabbath. I was what some might consider to be a messianic Jew in reverse. I went from Christianity back into the Old Testament. It wasn't just me, it was a movement, but I was actually a minister in this denomination that found wonder and beauty and actually structure that I needed. So wonder and beauty is maybe not the right words at all. I found the structure that I needed to structure my life by going back and looking at those laws and observing those laws and those commandments. Critical to me in my formative years to get me out of the, you mentioned sort of a dark place you were in for a while, and I was in a dark place as a child, and those very things that you moved away from were what helped me for several decades. I'm no longer involved in that at all, but it's interesting that you had the opposite experience. So unpack that a little bit more for me, what that was like. Were your parents, devout? Did you come from a devout, or was it less so?
Yeah, so I think the way I was raised was Judaism was a series of rules and traditions that were passed down. And, just 2 generations above me. So my grandparents, of course, there was an incredible amount of rich desire for me to carry on those traditions, largely because of the Holocaust and how it affected our family. Most of my family also was affected by the Polish pogroms back in the turn of the century, the 20th century. And so I feel like there was a lot of desire for me to carry on those traditions, but I was spiritually lacking. I wasn't connected to them. A sticking point, and I'll just say this out loud, is when I heard that God was a jealous God, I couldn't quite understand that. That was a tripping point for me, and I couldn't quite associate with that, and I needed to find a God that was a loving God that also understood science and merged those 2 things together, which up until that point in my life, I was very atheistic and very anti-God, and would want to prove to you through science that God didn't exist, which now it's very funny because I've completely done an about face and science shows me where God exists. So it's been a trip, man. It's been a trip.
Well, I really hope you're enjoying being on the show, because now I'm going to hound you to get you back on to dive into some of those topics later.
You bet, man. Totally.
So, and I'll let Jacqueline go into that in a little more detail later, if she chooses. So I'm going to just help unpack the overview, though. So how did you end up in your field of success, and how did that sort of, I'm going to call it darkness, or that void that was later filled, how did that play into your choice of a career going into the medical profession? And was there a point in your life as a, emerging, or as a teenager, high school, when did that occur for you?
So I was raised in a family of physicians. My dad, his 2 brothers, my mom's brother, several distant relatives were all physicians. And I was raised in an environment where they said, don't go into medicine. And so, like any good kid, that was exactly what I went into. I really enjoyed the ability to have this aura of knowing quite a bit. Like I was always impressed when my dad and his brothers would get together and they would talk about these various very complex situations in medicine, and I was just blown away by their depth and breadth of knowledge. And in many ways, I just wanted to ape that. I wanted to be smart. I wanted to be knowledgeable, and that dictated sort of the next steps. Which, as I went through high school, I did some athletic training, which is sports medicine, and I really enjoyed that. I wanted to know more and more and more. So it wasn't too surprising to me that I developed a voracious appetite. And in college, I was really straight and narrow. I did not party. I was, let's get this done. Let's do it right. And let's get straight A's, which unfortunately led to a lot of perfectionism, which later on sort of brought me to that dark place. This idea that I somehow control things, or that I, am magically gifted in some sort of way. I put a lot of pressure on myself, and it took me away from being able to live in the moment. Being infallible was a big problem. That I thought I had to be infallible. And
Interesting.
yeah, so I think that it was interesting. Those sorts of things. I mean, to me, there's no mistakes. That I needed all of that to get to where I am today, but I don't need that anymore now that I'm here.
I'm going to try to take that advice and apply it in the current situation with my teenage kids. We're having discussions about where do we put the guardrails, right? Where do we need to move the guardrails out a little bit and let them make a few more mistakes.
Yeah, mistakes are great because they're the best teachers, and I think that one of my problems was, and this was all very much driven by myself, not by my parents or anyone else in my life, was the idea that this illusion of perfectionism could be achieved, and that's a really tall order to put on my shoulders. And since then, being able to say things like "I made a mistake," even to my patients, it has been incredible freedom for me, and it's and having faith that it's all going to work out okay.
Well, a quick unplanned question there, just out of curiosity, given I have a wide interest in everything. And so now I've got somebody who I can ask this question of. So, how do you handle the, let's just say, the liability aspect? It's interesting that you say, not being afraid to mention that you made a mistake. I would think there are a lot of people who are afraid to sort of admit that because of the whole liability issue. Does that play into it at all with you, and how would you deal with that?
I make mistakes. I tell patients when I make mistakes. Often I'll explain how that mistake was made. People are sympathetic. Sometimes they're irritated. And from a liability standpoint, it's interesting. Colorado, and there are many states in the nation, if you fully disclose your mistakes to the patient, you're actually not liable for those mistakes so long as it was made an honest mistake. I do a lot of medical legal consulting. In fact, I had a deposition
So there's
earlier.
a difference between negligence and mistakes.
Correct. Negligence. Yeah, I do a lot of medical legal consulting, and I can tell you that the number one reason that I think a lot of the doctors get sued is they bury mistakes and then deny that they happened, and then patients and families are left very mystified and disappointed.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted. You were about to say something.
No, that was it.
A deposition, I think.
Oh, yeah, I had a deposition earlier today. In fact, in a great case of not owning mistakes, and the consequences. So much could have gone differently, and it could have saved a patient's life. But the
Wow.
digging in was not great.
Wow. Well, in the interest of not stealing too much time from Jacqueline, let me ask the final question here then. And then we'll go to a quick break before we bring Jacqueline and you on. So you mentioned earlier that your desire to hate winter less led to your art with snowflakes,
Yep.
but that's expanded into something more. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to share a few words on that.
Yeah, it's funny. I grew up in Colorado, and snow was always wonderful and magical as a child. And then when I started driving a Geo Metro and having to get to various hospitals, it was no longer a fun thing. And I hated winter so much, I actually moved to Florida for 14 years. That didn't really solve anything, as most geographic moves rarely do. It did solve the snow problem. But when I moved back, I'm like, I've got to find some way to connect with winter and tap into my wonderment. And I saw a snowflake photo that was taken by a photographer named Don Komarechka out of Canada. And I was like, nah, that's not real. That can't possibly be real. And so then I started realizing maybe I could do that too. And Don actually served as a mentor for me to learn how to do his techniques. I've modified them a little. And boy, I'll tell you what, now I'm looking for tonight, it's going to start snowing at around 11 p.m. So I'm going to be up looking forward to finding those snowflakes and capturing them and sharing them with other people, because I love the stories that they tell.
Well, right here in Wisconsin, there are a couple of people right in this house who are looking forward to it start snowing as well, because my kids are predicting another snow day tomorrow and getting out of school. Right. But we're gonna go to commercial break, and when we come back, the audience is going to get to see some of those pictures, and Jacqueline will take us through a series of fascinating questions. This has been some of the 10 most enjoyable minutes of my life. Jason, thank you so much for joining us. And I can't wait to watch from backstage to hear the rest of this.
That sounds great, Wade.
And welcome to Something or Other Publishing, or as our friends like to call us, Soup. Soup is a platform that connects authors, readers, and service providers in one convenient place. Choose Soup if you're an author with a great book idea and you're looking for a publisher offering hands-on coaching in some of the best royalties in the business. Or if you're a reader who enjoys engaging with celebrated and emerging authors. We already have over 3,000 of them, and more are joining every day. You can even win free books by voting on their book ideas. Or maybe you're a service provider and you're looking to engage with over 3,000 authors. We're here to help. So whether you're an author, a reader, or a service provider, you're in the right place at Soup. Contact us at help@soupllc.com to learn more.
All right. So, Jason, I think we should approach the interview the way you do your snowflake photos. Just hold your breath and hope that Jackie's internet doesn't bump her off. So I'm so glad.
It's always fun watching what you get done.
Yeah, I'll
Go
get
ahead.
frozen in the craziest expressions for everyone. Hopefully we're all good. I just want to mention to our live audience, anyone out there, please engage in the chat, ask questions of Jason, let us know you're out there. We will actually having a giveaway for a hardback of my book, Noble Beings, that will have an ad for it. So let us know you're out there, and your winning chance is just with the pithiest or smartest or funnest comment. So, well, Jason, I'm so glad to talk to you. I did snooping, some research on you, and not only are you this wonderful photographer, notably most well known from these amazing photos, but you also shoot different environmental phenomena like storms and eclipses, and you also are a competitive fencer and stand-up comedian. Is this true?
I was a stand-up comedian, and I just couldn't make the height requirements work. So no, I did do stand-up comedy for a number of years, and I'm pretty good with a quick, pithy comment, like you were saying. But I had to retire.
Yes. Well, we're expecting of you.
And I did do competitive, but unfortunately, I've also kind of been out of that. And yeah, so such a bummer. I love the comment, natural Robin Williams. I love when patients tell me I sound and look like Robin Williams. He's my spirit animal. So,
I can see that. That's so great. Competitive fencing is very good. My husband did competitive fencing in college too. The stand-up comedy, was that part of your dark phase?
It eventually, it was the beginning of, because there's a lot of perfectionism involved in making sure you get the audience to laugh. And it also is a place where a lot of manipulation occurs. You're trying to manipulate people to like you and think you're funny. So that's a thing.
That's true. Well, what I think of is courage. It takes a lot of courage because no one can fake a laugh. The audience is not going to fake a laugh. So you're really on the line there. So kudos.
Tell me
that. Yeah. And you just seem like a really well-rounded, and I can tell that your family is before you. So I was excited to get to meet you.
Yeah, my family is the priority.
That's so good. Much to talk about. Well, I'd like to start with your beautiful photos, and maybe our producer can bring on some of your my favorites are the dreamscapes. I wanted to know what started this for you. What made you want to capture here's snowflakes that he's become famous for?
Yeah. So obviously the snowflakes, because when you look at them, they are just spectacular. And to me, the physical laws that dictate a snowflake are those that were created by God. And so just having that opportunity to see that here, God has a sense of humor. There's Batman on this particular one. Those colors are naturally,
Wow.
science behind that's pretty cool, but it's like when you see a soap bubble or gas on water, you'll see those same sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So pretty amazing stuff. Just, I love that.
Yeah, these snowflakes really do speak to intelligent design. I would imagine it'd be hard for anyone to look at your series of these and not believe in a God that has handcrafted these.
Yeah, I mean they are, and we lose sight of that. Like, for example, here's a rare one, which is a 12-pointed snowflake. It's actually two snowflakes stuck together that grew together, because if you look in the center, it's still only got 6 sides. All snowflakes have 6 sides. But the
Interesting.
two snowflakes very early on that one hitched the ride on the other, and they formed. And it's very interesting. There are no two snowflakes alike. That's very true. Just like there are no two trees alike. But they are just, when you look at this and you think, God, that is just the coolest thing. And it's all because of this water vapor and how it turns into frozen water. I mean, somebody's out there carving each one of these while we're sitting here trying to get them off our car and shovel our walk. They're all pretty amazing, and that's pretty spectacular. So also, this is a 6-sided snowflake. It's just the 3 of the sides are really, really, really tiny. Everyone always thinks it's 3-sided, but it's not 6-sided.
Wow.
And this one's one of my favorites, is a snowflake within a snowflake, which I captured right before Christmas. So that was pretty special. And that was the one that sort of got me viral right there.
Wow. Snowflake within a snowflake. That's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I say because I go with the question I was asking, or do I go in a new direction? Because when I see those in that handcrafted nature and how you, it's there, it's all around us. I'm sure this perhaps phenomena as artful as the snowflake, but there's all kinds of wonderment around us all the time. But most of the time we're not aware of that, right? We're trying to scrape it off our windshield so we can get to work and that sort of thing. And you mentioned in the earlier part when you were talking to Wade about the experience you had that opened you up spiritually or connected you with God, and this sense of momentum in the universe. And again, as a I explore the interconnection of all things, so the atoms and the planets, how there's this harmony between them. Like, is here between that experience you had, that epiphany of God, and then what is witnessed through those snowflakes?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that vision I had of momentum was the rules that dictate the universe were dictated by that higher power, and we get to see that in both the microscopic and the macroscopic. So when I'm out chasing, tornadic thunderstorms, eclipses, or the aurora borealis, all of those phenomena occur because of the rules that were set down at the very beginning. And I think that it's incredible to see how those rules play out individually. It's just amazing.
Mm-hmm. And we need those reminders, because that brings a great deal of peace, I think, to the individual, and it also reminds us that our lives have meaning.
Well, and I think the reality is that we live in a very hurry world, and so my hope is both for me when I'm taking these photographs and for the people who are viewing them, that they slow down and appreciate exactly what's going on in that moment. That they, one of the coolest things is that people tell me that they now look at their coat when it's covered with snowflakes to see if they can find any of the cool snowflakes, or take a moment and observe the clouds and breathe. I mean, that's what living is, right? It's not all the stuff up in my head that is constantly going. That's not real. What's real is right outside of me and around me. And so that's the cool part about this kind of photography.
Right. Now, a practical question: how do you reconcile that, the hurry nature of modern life, and this taking a deep breath and appreciating the moment. You were obviously a man of great accomplishment, plus your family is number one. Like, in other words, I would imagine busy. And I hate that word, and I hate that it's often used as a good thing. Like, you staying busy? It's like, please, no. But unfortunately, we are. And I think, to accomplish things, often you have to be. So how do you personally balance that accomplishing with also truly living your life?
Oh, I forget, like everybody else. I need to remind myself. I have people in my life who I meet with on a regular basis, and we spend a lot of time really dedicating our lives to making sure that we're trying to be of maximal service to others, being sure to be present, practicing meditation, prayer, these sorts of things. Those are the ways that I stay grounded. And I saw that there was a person who, yes, about Masaru Emoto's work. So unfortunately, Masaru Emoto's work, and he was an interesting guy. He wanted to look at how ice crystallized based on intention and thought. And he was a Japanese scientist. Unfortunately, his work was actually fraudulent. So sadly could never be reproduced by anybody else. But his concept of infusing intention into the world, I think, is still a good thing. I think that like attracts like. And so I think there's a reason that I end up getting to see the snowflakes I do, in part because I put that out into the universe as well. So yeah, but he basically showed that bad thoughts made crystallization not happen well, and good thoughts led to beautiful crystallization. But that's been scientifically debunked, unfortunately. But it's a beautiful idea. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful idea, except it's fake. That's terrible.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people will see the things that they want to see. That's one of the dangers in science, is trying to find your own hypothesis as proven. That can be a danger spot.
So you think he may have been sincere in his error?
I think a lot of people believe what they believe and want verification of that. And so there's a difference between scientific rigor and seeing what you want to see. So I don't know that he did it maliciously at all.
Right. That's very fair of you. Well, I just want the audience to know that you do teach how to take these photos. You have a whole YouTube channel on how to take these amazing photos.
Just run right there through YouTube, and you'll find those videos.
Yeah. Well, I did want to take the opportunity, since you are such a well-rounded, awesome, exploring this. The theme of the show is the role of religion in society, and we approach it from a lot of different perspectives. And there is this historic perceived dichotomy between the sciences and religion. And so I guess in general, if you have any thoughts on that, since you've obviously bridged that, and then we might get into more topical aspects of that topic as well.
Sure. I think that, man has a tendency to like what man thinks. So sort of the same thing that we were just talking about. I think a lot of people believe that science will have all the answers, and that we'll be able to unravel the mysteries. But, God put a sort of, it's very interesting. You can see the limit of what God's going to allow us to do if you get all the way down to the uncertainty principle. And at the very, very small level of if we close all the way into the smallest scales, we cannot actually get any further definition, because the uncertainty principle basically creates this thing called quantum foam. So at the very microscopic level, it is impossible to actually see things because things are uncertain. It's also interesting that God created a universe where if you get into this microscopic world, the outcomes of experiments are dictated by somebody observing the experiments. So it's the whole Schrodinger's cat thing. A cat in a box that is a gas, that the cat is, according to quantum mechanics, is both alive and dead at the same time, until somebody opens the box to figure out if the cat's alive or dead. And then at that point in time, the cat becomes one or the other. These sorts of things show that science won't have all the answers. We have limits. There's a limit to what we're allowed to see. And So science is going to get us a long way, but it's not the only thing. And I think if we look at science, we can actually try to or not legislate, but argue over happiness and what does happiness mean, and what is the soul, and I don't think those are definable in classic scientific terms, but I do think that science leads the way to God, because what we do find is fascinating. There's an endless set of riddles there, and that's fun. I mean, to get to see how this place is put together, and you kick the tires and see how it works. To me, there's nothing better than that.
Mm-hmm. That's so beautiful. And I think that's perhaps somewhat rare for someone in your field to reach that point.
It was rare for me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't admit that. I was frustrated at that time in my life with the inability to explain everything. Now I find that really cool.
And you don't need to explain it, right? It's the wonder element. Yeah. What are your thoughts? I know I heard some observations, and I thought they were interesting and relevant during the height of the COVID episode, where, it seemed that perhaps science was, in our increasingly secular society, replacing religion, and not so much in reason triumphing over superstition, but somewhat of the opposite, where there were these slogans like "trust the science," when I thought science was a process of like discovery and trial and error and that sort of thing, or like Dr. Fauci saying that he was science, like this sort of language that arose that sounded, like a certain blind faith, so to speak. Do you have any thoughts about that criticism? Sure. I guess.
I think the unfortunate thing is most people don't understand science. That's sort of the bottom line, and the way we approach things scientifically. So the thing that was very interesting during COVID, and I'm on the front lines still of the COVID pandemic, and I can tell you that there was an incredible amount of misinformation that happened, and part of it is that people don't quite understand how science works. Science is having a hypothesis, then testing the hypothesis, and then getting closer to the truth each time. So the nice part about science is you can both be wrong or right, and both move you forward. It's one of the most amazing parts of that. The reality is that science was scrutinized by opinion, and pure science in its most real form is not based on opinion. Ideally, what it is something is put forward, tested, and if found to be what appears to be true, tested again and again and again to be disproven. That's the purpose of science. Right. So early on in the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of things that happened early on. We had a crisis on our hands, and people were really spitballing. I mean, it really was. It was terrifying during that first 6 months. It was very scary, but over time, the scientific process continued to refine what it was that COVID did, how it caused symptoms, how it killed people, and how treatments could be directed to stop that. Given the fact that happened in 6 months, what most people missed was what an incredible, miraculous effort that was being undertaken. The community really delivered. I mean, from being inside of it, I can tell you that we really delivered. But what happened at the same time was people were using non-scientific approaches to argue against science. So the lowest form of science that we can ever have is our own personal experience. So our personal experiences are not scientifically valid. So if I, swallow a rock a day and I never get attacked by tigers, then I could make the connection that the rocks are preventing me from being attacked by tigers. But the reality is I don't live in a place that there are tigers. But I can make that leap of logic because both things are true at the same time. And we saw a lot of that happening. And so it's interesting that I think that the mistake that was made and continues to be made is the idea that science has the right answer all the time, but that it is an evolving process and subject.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that looking to science to solve problems like COVID is the correct thing to do. Because the way that the approach is not based on opinion. It's based on science. Now, a lot of people also don't know how to look at the medical literature, and that became a real problem during the pandemic because a single study also does not dictate how things go. And a lot of people were publishing some pretty cruddy studies that were immediately disproven by the scientific community. But that one study, like for ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, which were raised very early on based on some very poorly done science, when actually scrutinized over very carefully controlled trials, the benefits of those drugs were disproven. But people continued to cling to the original papers. And so that was another issue.
You think they've been disproven, that ivermectin HCQ helps?
Oh, they absolutely have. Yep, in multiple large trials, including some randomized clinical control trials subsequently have been done, which is the gold standard for medication. There's absolutely no question effective, but the lingering harm that came from people thinking that that was the case, that they did work, was that patients who used, like, for example, hydroxychloroquine as part of their treatment for lupus were unable to get the medication. But because people were clinging to case reports, or the worst kind of science was what I like to call the press conference science, somebody coming forward and saying, this is so, and then everyone would say, oh, they're just being silenced by the scientific community. The reality is the scientific community is the most effective at weeding out what is and is not valid over time. And so great claims need to be greatly proven. Now, John Pills just said that placebos make a difference. He's absolutely correct. 30% of people will get better with placebo on any trial. 30%.
Yeah.
So,
well, speaking of placebos and also press conferences and that sort of thing, what about the belief under which many people took the vaccine, that it was safe, safe and effective, and also that it would stop transmission and infection, or that was the original hope for people, and then we've discovered it doesn't stop infection. And then there was a recent case with the European Special Council where the Pfizer rep said that they had never tested for transmission. And in the context of this show, and I just felt like that was a representation of a certain kind of blind faith, people moving in a direction of a belief that hadn't been thoroughly brought, made clear to them. Do you have any thought that?
Sure. So there's several things that you said that are of interest to me. The first is the mRNA vaccines had actually been in development since 2001. They'd been tested for the original SARS on thousands of volunteers and were followed over time, and that they were found to be safe. So they weren't new, and a lot of people continue to talk about them as novel. And the reason that they were novel is the idea of rolling out a new type of vaccination. Typically, we use, dead portions of the virus that we want, and just give it into you and hope that your body will develop immune system to this. So the mRNA vaccines as a mass vaccination was a new concept. But there were several things you mentioned. The blind faith. So there were very good clinical control trials that showed that people stopped dying and getting hospitalized when they got the vaccine. And when we look at the impact on vaccines worldwide, as they were rolled out to different countries, there was an immediate drop in mortality and hospitalization that was directly related to when the vaccines were rolled out in the countries. So, for example, the European Union and the United States and Canada were some of the first to get the vaccine, and we had the most immediate drop off after that. But then as they've slowly gotten dispersed throughout the world, every single time those vaccines are rolled out, there's been a drop off in mortality and hospitalization. So the question about whether it controls transmission of disease was never what we were studying. We're trying to keep people from dying. And I think lost in the vaccine literature is this idea that getting the vaccine will completely prevent you from getting the illness. Now, I've been vaccinated 5 times because I have to frequently be vaccinated, and I've had the bivalent vaccine, and I still ended up getting COVID in January, but I didn't die from it, and I didn't get hospitalized from it. And I can tell you that sort of issue of hospitalization and death is the marker of a good vaccine. What got lost in there is the messaging that you talked about blind faith. There was a lot of safeguards being put in place, and one of the most rigorous is that we monitor vaccination safety through a reporting system, and this is done worldwide in various countries. And if there was actually any noise to any of the vaccination harms, then they were looked into. And it did turn out that the AstraZeneca vaccine did cause a significant but extremely small bump in heart injury in younger adult males. And it became instantly it was no longer prescribed, and it was never approved by the FDA. One of the things that was fascinating about the COVID pandemic in particular and the interpretation of things is people blew up the side effects or the toxicities that can occur as being proportionate to the toxicities and side effects that COVID had. So where we were losing millions of people to COVID, the number of people who we think demonstrably were harmed and died because of the vaccine was under 50. And to this day is still under 50. Now, people had consequences from the vaccine. There's no question about that. But the number of people who got that were so much smaller than what the virus did. A great example is this myocarditis thing. It's inflammation of the heart muscle. Less than 350 cases have been reported worldwide from the vaccine, but COVID itself causes it extremely commonly. Like around 4% of patients will end up with myocarditis from that. Now, if you take 4% of all the patients who had COVID, that's hundreds of thousands of people. But people equate the 300 or so that had it as being risky from getting the COVID vaccine to the risk of actually COVID-induced myocarditis. So it was very interesting to see how that played out, that people's biggest fears were that the side effects of the vaccine would somehow be devastating. And perhaps for some people that is true, that does happen. But the risk of the COVID and the consequences there were minuscule, when in fact it was a devastating blight on this country's history, what happened with COVID. And so that was an example of how people can't really understand scientific concepts, unfortunately, because we don't have good science education. If they understood that if you look at the number of people affected, they would be able to look at those numbers directly. And what's interesting is those numbers were widely available and have been transparent throughout the pandemic. But people have chosen not to look at those numbers themselves because they're not adept at looking at the literature. And then there's this idea that science is trying to crush alternate opinions, when that's very clearly not the case. We invite alternative opinions. They just have to be tested and vetted so that we learn from this. And
right.
that's
And
part
that
of the
is the
process.
scientific process, right? Exactly. I think it was not so much that science as a community was trying to crush necessarily, but that the expressions of the media, and because I think the media did say it'll stop transmission. Like there was also
The media has been a nightmare.
Yeah, and the medical literature is, it's sort of like your tax rules. It may be there for people, but it's hard to read and interpret.
It is.
And in the height of when we were masking before the vaccine came out, I did go through some of the CDC literature, and of course I'm like such a layman, but I did see like charts, and if I was like, if I'm reading this right, it's saying that if you wear a mask, you're actually like more likely to get it, like different incongruities where, I tried to expose myself to the actual literature, but it didn't seem to match up with the popular advice and notions of what we were supposed to be doing. So I think that's the kind of thing that led to this confusion and cognitive dissonance with people.
Yeah, that may be. The CDC never had anything that showed the masks would increase your risk. It's been true that before the COVID pandemic, we didn't have a lot of data on masking except for influenza, actually, and that was in very limited areas. So we didn't have the data one way or the other. But what's interesting is that people were willing to believe in the pandemic and their neighbors' sisters' advice more than they were sort of what the science behind things were. And the science there were so many attempts by so many organizations to deliver the science in something palatable, because you're absolutely right. It can get very confusing if you're not familiar with going through the literature. But there was a lot of political agendas, unfortunately. And the sad part is that it's hard, and it's still hard. Just look at, what viral posts, come up on different topics politically that aren't vetted. People showing, attacks that occurred, years ago and claiming this happened just 2 days ago. So it's hard to learn. It's hard for people to understand that. But the goal's always, and John's correct in his comment, the goal was to flatten the curve and decrease the number of people who died. And masking definitely did make a difference, believe it or not. And there are studies that now back that up. But we didn't have that back then. There was no data on public masking. So it was very hard to sort through what we should be doing, but it does make a difference.
Yeah. Well, I'll find the screenshot from the document, and you can help me interpret it then. Yeah, and I'm sincere about that. I think too. Wade. Okay, so we have a break.
Wade wants us to stop talking, or me to stop talking.
No, he wants to be part of the conversation, I think. So we're going to go to a quick commercial break, and then we will be back with all three of us, I believe.
Bursting with joy on every page. An illustrated handbook of spiritual truths to help children learn lifelong gems of guidance, who we truly are, how to live, how to pray, how to treat others. Enjoyed by children and families around the world, inspiring meaningful conversations, powerful self-images, good habits, devotion, courtesy, truthfulness, friendship, Noble Beings Spiritual Handbook for Children of All Ages, a special collection of wisdom from the Baha'i writings, illustrated by spiritual realism painter Jacqueline Clare, empower children of all ages to be the noble beings they are meant to be. Available in hardback, paperback, and ebook on Amazon.
Yay! Awesome.
Hey there. I was absolutely not clamoring to get in, just to make sure that our sponsors also get featured. But it's hard. It's hard to find a good place to break, because Jason, it's such a joy having you here to share your perspective. I know that we will have some viewers who will want to take exception to a lot of the things you've said. Sure. And the point is, we want to have people who are articulate and can clearly present their position. And I'm very grateful to you for having done so. And if someone, would like to challenge any of the things that you've said, clearly you're the type of individual who would welcome that and would be willing to have a very civil discussion and look at what they have to offer. Again, we're both family men and teenagers in the house. How to get your teenagers to, you can challenge me, but do it with respect, right? Yeah. That sass, that attitude that comes across sometimes, it doesn't help things, right? And these are topics that people are very attached to. To your point, I love the analogy about personal experience not being scientific.
Correct.
And but anyway, I have a dominant personality. I tend to dominate. I wasn't trying to get in here and interrupt and derail, but those are my initial.
And I have another question if you want, but I thought that maybe you had a comment. That's why I brought you in.
I have lots that I could make, but I'm going to try to restrain myself. I want to just give you a chance, Jacqueline, because it's not often we let you sort of talk about your work. But I think in the context of today's show, I wanted you to spend a moment on your book, which was just in the ad, in particular because you're doing a giveaway as well, right? We've got a number of really good comments today. It might be hard for you to pick which lucky audience participant is going to get a copy of your book. But what is your book achieving, or what are you attempting to achieve through your book in the context of tonight's show, Noble Beings?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, so no, I'll show it in a second, but it's Noble Beings. It's a spiritual handbook for children of all ages, which includes us. When it comes to the spiritual realm, we're always children and learning and meant to make our hearts more receptive. And of course, to inspire critical thinking, a sense of each individual's spiritual nobility and individuality. I don't know if that applies to the theme of tonight necessarily. I guess it does, the snowflakes and the scientific process. This is page 1. Let's see, how do I get it in front of my camera? We're on backwards. The quote is, "Truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues." So it's like meant to visually illustrate what the words mean to help children understand, like, oh, what is a foundation? What's a foundation? It's a building site. So it's just these deep truths and little bite-sized meditation pieces for children and adults, and hopefully makes people smile, if nothing else.
Thank you.
Is that sort of what you were asking for, Wade? Yeah.
Well, absolutely. To make sure that one lucky person is gonna get a copy of that. So, if your comment,
awesome.
If your comment is chosen, then we'll definitely want to get your information to get you that book sent. I do want to show one comment here to make sure that we give those people who are going to challenge you their due on this show. Here we have one of our viewers who, talking from personal experience, but nonetheless citing an individual who's involved in the clinical research. I could also refer to my wife is a physical therapist and has looked into this. She's actually a doctor of physical therapy, and so her doctorate, very much evidence-based. Everything that she does has to be evidence-based, and we've had a number of discussions on a decision in particular of whether or not to have our youngest son vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And we delayed. She was one of the first ones. She was obviously on the front line. So she was offered the vaccine early and pretty much had to take the vaccine in order to keep her job, whether or not she wanted to. I've got family up in Canada, both of whom, for whatever reason, were not wanting to take the vaccine. Their jobs were at risk, and they both, were threatened or actually lost their jobs. One of them then went and got the vaccine and did develop myocarditis. To your point, didn't die. These are personal, individual experiences, and yet nonetheless, it's one data point. It's not, and I have experience in data science, so I understand how that works. It's only one data point, and that data point can be blown out of proportion like a gigantic picture of a snowflake. But that snowflake is compelling in its individuality.
It is. These individual stories are quite compelling. So to the point, so the best science that we have in medicine are what are called meta-analyses. And basically meta-analyses, the ones that do them the best are the Cochrane library. They basically do some incredible stuff that's published there is really high quality. And the way that they approach a meta-analysis, which basically is a collection of every single study on a given topic to try and take their objective data and sort of smush it to find out what the truth actually is, while still listing the individual studies data. So you can do this with ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. You can do this with masks, and you can also do this with the vaccine. And there's not even a question on this. So meta-analysis takes the equivalent of doing a study with millions of people, and by taking all of these studies that have X number of people and pools the data together. And meta-analyses are considered very, very strongly as the highest level of medicine, unless they find that the data conflicts. And that also is helpful too. If the data is conflicting, then we don't actually have good information. But the data is unequivocal. So when people tell me, that so-and-so is a researcher, for example, or, that, somebody worked for Pfizer or anybody else, and I can respect that, the meta-analyses don't lie. And one of the things that's cool about the meta-analyses is they're not country specific. They're basically pooling the world's literature. So you're not just looking at like American data, you're looking at data from the European Union, from Africa, from South America. So you're basically taking all of these studies to see what the global perspective is. And the nice part about that is it often gets rid of, for example, bias that happens from drug companies alone. Because I will tell you right now, drug companies have been pretty shifty by themselves. And there's reason to be concerned about the Pfizers in the world. I'm not lying. They've had drugs which were released with very sketchy data. Fortunately, science caught what those are and got those drugs off the market. But there's no question that there's some sketch there.
Well, and on that point, and in the interest of time, because I don't want to just keep talking about the vaccine, and with your permission, we're going to go a little bit over time, because I want to circle back more to topics that are even bigger and more important than this very, very interesting, fascinating, and important topic. So I just want to ask one more question on that, just to get your take. Sure. Early on in the fear, and you and I had a chat beforehand about how my perspective is, being a former minister and spending time in the book of Revelation and the 4 horsemen of apocalypse, I'm in wonder and awe at how science has taken on the role of the wild-eyed prophet predicting, the sun is going to get 7 times hotter, straight out of the book of Revelation. We're going to have devastating climate change. We're going to have, the pale horse of disease. We're going to have pandemics that are going to wipe out all of humanity, right? These same horrifying prophetic scenarios from the book of Revelation somehow became the domain of science in recent years. It's kind of a little bit of a joke, but there's some truth to it. My point is, you talked about earlier the fear at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was a lot of fear, and there were some knee-jerk reactions. And one that was of particular interest and concern to me was the suppression of the very simple scientific fact that natural immunity, when acquired, is very powerful. And there was a suppression of this truth, seemingly to me in the interest of, well, we don't want people, to focus on that in any way, shape, or form, because obviously, many people are going to die before they achieve natural immunity from this disease. And so it's a moot point that those who survive the disease will have a natural immunity to the disease. You follow me? So this idea of getting to herd immunity really, to me, seemed to squelch and diminish the very idea of this thing called natural immunity, an immunity that is acquired by being exposed to the actual condition. And some very intelligent people who have PhDs in, like one person in economics was flat out denying that natural immunity was as good as the vaccine in its effectiveness at keeping you from getting the disease again. And I think over time, we've learned that if you did have COVID, your natural immunity is perhaps stronger than the immunity acquired by a vaccine. So this is just one area of 9th grade biology that seemed to be subverted and upended, which is perhaps one reason, just one data point of why people begin to lose faith in the messaging that's coming out. Just one example of something that was fudged or declared to be untrue that was in fact true. And I use that one data point in terms of the whole picture of during that fear phase, what was the ultimate damage of squelching discussion amongst people in the interest of, well, we're also afraid and we want to prevent millions of people from dying, so therefore it's worth just stopping this talk and stopping certain voices and certain opinions from getting out there. Big question. There's not a simple answer. I'm not asking for a black and white answer, but just your reaction.
So I think that the messaging that I heard very consistently is we didn't want people to get natural immunity because it meant that people were going to die. So I think it wasn't that we felt like natural immunity was inferior. It's that people were dying, and not only were they dying, but as we now know, 25 to 30% of people who get COVID have long COVID, which can include heart attacks, strokes, kidney damage. There's a lot of really serious big ticket items. And
do you think any of that was due to the hospital protocols with remdesivir and the ventilators?
Well, I think
moving
that
forward?
we didn't know how to ventilate people properly at the beginning of the pandemic because we approached it as we did for most, but that the initial alpha strain that we dealt with was deadly, and we continue to see long COVID as being a huge problem for the current strains. And so while it's great to have natural immunity, we have to then accept the mortality and the long-term morbidity that accompanies that, and it would have crippled the United States economy.
Right. What I'm getting at is that, in terms of information suppression, does the end justify the means? Right. You follow
Well, again,
me?
I think that's all media. I don't,
Yeah.
if you want to know the honest truth, I don't think the media knows how to handle science either. And I think that they want people who are going to say the most explosive things. And that's also a different type of agenda. So, it's an interesting issue because if you're taking that data point and it's an interesting data point, nothing was necessarily smudged, but there may have been media bias to present it in a certain way. I think all of us realize that natural immunity actually is usually superior. And actually what it turns out in long-term studies is natural immunity plus the vaccination is the best prevention of the next illness.
Well, again, my frustration is on this point, the inability to have intelligent discussions, right? The sort of the herd mentality triggered by the fear
Sure.
that shut down civil discourse. And you mentioned earlier about things being politicized, and the polarization and the exacerbation of the echo chambers.
Yes.
Such that basic, simple truths were vehemently denied. I'm not citing some official source, but in the general discourse of the population, because people were pushed into camps and unable to talk to each other, and the bad ideas got exacerbated and reverberated. You follow me? Again, this hermetically sealed belief system that I referred to earlier, where you're within a camp and it becomes almost all consuming, and it causes all kinds of problems.
Yeah, I think the best thing would have been to have scientists really bring out what the data were. I mean, basically, but that didn't happen in the major media. That was happening in a lot of different discourse, but unfortunately, I think that there was a big disservice. There was a lot of disorganization of the administration at the time that the COVID pandemic rolled out. It limited the ability to actually have sort of a unified thing. But no, people should always question the data. The beauty of, we were talking about perfectionism earlier. There is no perfectionism. It's okay to make mistakes. And I think we learned a lot through mistakes of the COVID pandemic, even on how to carry the message. So I think that there was a lot of benefit that came from that. It was costly and it was hard, but I think we're continuing to grow.
All right. Well, we may have you back on this topic. I think the opportunity for a venue in which this can be discussed openly and honestly, I think people need that. I think people need to have their concerns voiced and heard, and they need to, it's going to take time for them to say, well, no, get through. Well, that's not really what I was asking. That, unpack it, to really unpack it and get to the heart and core of the issues. I'm seeing some of the comments. There might even be some frustration with some viewers about not being able to get down and dig into, the very specific question that they have. And so if you're willing to come back, we might dive more into this. But I want to then go back to, so let me take this in a completely different direction with your permission, Jacqueline. I don't know if you had something else you wanted to get to.
Good. Go ahead.
Now our producer is saying break. So when we come back from the break, I will take this in a completely different direction. And tonight we are going to go a little overtime. So go ahead and run that, Sir Producer.
Your story has the power to start a movement. Journalism is more than a tool for broadcasting news. It's an important way of fostering meaningful cultural relationships that create tangible change in our society. With our anthology journalism behind bars, you can now do your part and make your mark. From expert writers to passionate amateur, everyone has a story to tell. Our aim is to promote equality, empathy, and create a safe space for different perspectives and interpretations of the world around us. Come join us today and break free from the toxic news cycle by submitting your story to journalism behind bars at info@soupllc.com.
So for the audience, we will be launching a separate show that is less religious, where this particular instance of the show might then have landed once we have that other show. But the main sponsor of this program, Something or Other Publishing, is not a religious publisher. And we'll then be able to dive even more deeply into religious topics on this show. And the cultural journalism show will open it up more to topics of interest to those who don't necessarily have a religious lens. But in the interest of the essential unity of religion and science, the direction I want to take this in is this idea of the independent investigation of the truth. Now, Jacqueline and I are both Baha'is, and the underlying principle of the Baha'i faith, one of them, there are several, but one of them that is critical is the independent investigation of the truth. And there are these writings called the hidden words. The second of those talks about seeing it through your own eyes and not through the eyes of another. So independent of any discussion of vaccines and pandemic, this point about that single data point and the uniqueness of each snowflake, the uniqueness of each individual, right? If a snowflake is unique, how much more so are each of us unique, right? In many faceted ways, not just the 6 dimensions, the 6 sides of a snowflake. We have many more facets than a snowflake that can all be unique. Each of us perceives the world differently. And you talked about that quantum foam, right? Where there's a mystery, there's an unseen part. I've equated that with the free will at the material level, right? The quantum particle has free will in that sense, that we can't know its spin. There's this entanglement, and it's all fascinating. But at the emergence of matter, you have this free will concept, and we are the quantum particle at the emergence of consciousness and the bridge towards the divine. Each of us has the right and the ability to see it differently. And that when the wave function collapses and we understand what's happening, we can then know, right? And when it aggregates up, it becomes predictable and certain. But we as individuals, my fantasy is that God chooses not to know what I'm going to do at this moment. My analogy, to go back to the Holocaust, is that if you were alive in Nazi Germany, you could have saved a Jew, but you would not have toppled Hitler, right? The march of history and the prophetic framework by a being that exists outside of time and space, right? If God exists outside of time and space, it's easy for him to write history in advance. That would be prophecy. But he would choose to not know what you're going to do in a given moment.
Yeah.
Because he's given you free will and he honors that. It's like, okay, I'm not going to barge into my daughter's bedroom without knocking because I've given her that freedom, to have her own space. Where do I put the guardrails? So all of this scales up and down from, the pre-molecular level. Now, this long-winded monologue, what am I getting at? Well, what I'm getting at is that the independent investigation of the truth, how do we retain that in a world that is advancing towards a collective, where we have global problems affecting millions of people, and we have international cooperation and international agencies, we have an emerging world order that some traditional fundamentalist Christians, of which I was one, and I still claim, in some sense, to be a fundamentalist, believing in the accurate transmission of the Word of God in holy writings from thousands of years ago. How do we square that circle? How do we allow the independent investigation of the truth and autonomy and individual sovereignty, right? Created in the image of God means you were created in God's image, and he made you sovereign, right? He gives you the ability to have that privacy, to make your own decisions, even to have religious freedom in this country. Where does that quantum particle spin level stand in terms of this emerging world order, whether it be climate change or pandemic or whatever decisions need to be made at a macro global level as we move forward?
Yeah. So first of all, free will is such an amazing gift. For me, my experience with God is that he is curious, and I use he only because I don't know. I don't know that God is gendered. I don't know these things. He hasn't revealed any of that to me, so I'm just going to use he for simplicity. It's very interesting that there's a joy in the curiosity I think he has with us, even when we're making mistakes. He loves us enough to let us make mistakes. And I think that there's something to be said about all of that, that the free will is not about destiny. It's about seeing the creativity of humans. And really, we're fairly unique. There are some other species that are also very creative in how they approach things, and I think qualify as intelligent. But the interesting part about that is things move. We're still primates, so we tend to want to huddle in masses and protect ourselves from predation. So I think it's not uncommon to see sort of these sort of unified approaches to different things. Humanity is a series of incredibly positive things that have happened over time. We certainly are far better off than we were in the time of the monarchs, and better off when we were in the time of emperors and all of this. But that took evolution of principle thought. And I believe that whatever we're moving toward, it's something unique that is purely human, and God's along for the ride. In my view of God, I'm no expert. He also doesn't speak to me directly. He only does it indirectly, which is a memo that I've been sending to him. That really, I'm kind of like a Moses guy. I'd like a couple tablets in my hands, but he doesn't do that, and that's disappointing, but very factual. But the thing is that we're going to evolve because of who we are as people, and I think it'll always be ultimately for the better, even if we make mistakes along the line. Obviously World War II is a horrific example of man's inhumanity to man, but we're not there anymore. We've grown as a species, and I think God's curious, and so I think it'll be interesting to see. So verifying the truth for oneself is just constantly finding this path toward God, which is done at the very individual level. It's an inside job, right? God's inside me. It's an inside job. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But it will continue to evolve. That's also pretty neat. That's like a promise until we either annihilate ourselves or find some other way to survive. But I'm actually pretty optimistic. I think that people will, on the whole, find a way to make the best out of this. And I am definitely a glass half full kind of guy.
Well, I'll share with you an insight that I've had since starting this show. You probably haven't seen all the past episodes to have heard this. I've mentioned it on this show before, but when we mentioned World War II and the horror, right? And I lived in Germany for 10 years. We talked a little bit about that. I visited Dachau multiple times in my time there, and other areas. So one of the things that came out of World War II was, of course, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, but also, which is, providing, we're still not completely out of the woods on that issue, but it provides some safety and security for people who have been tortured and persecuted for many thousands of years. But at the same time, in that same year, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was established at the United Nations. And I've shared how I made a correlation between Matthew 25, in which it says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will judge the nations. And then it defines how he's going to separate them like sheep and goats. And the criteria that he uses, it's the criteria from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'd always looked at that at an individual level, right? Am I giving a glass of water to the thirsty? Am I visiting, the sick? Your work is in fulfillment of one of those requirements, right? Tending to the sick and the infirmed, but also tending to those in prison and treating them in a humane way and giving them justice, right? Putting clothes on people. Those are all the things that are listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it suddenly occurred to me, well, that's how the nations as a whole are being judged. Are these scaled up entities delivering those things that historically we were giving at an individual level, right? Does the collective take a collective responsibility? And at this aggregate, complicated scale, are we focused on that? Are we trying to deliver that in our efforts? You talked earlier about, are we just busy pursuing our ambitions and our goals, or do we invest our work? Talking about the fraudulent snowflake study, are we investing our work with the right intent, right, to produce better crystals, better systems, right, better solutions that deliver those fundamental, essential human rights? And of course, in the book of Matthew, the whole point of the book of Matthew, looking at the words of Jesus, is do not judge. Whatever standard of judgment you arrive at, that's how I'm going to judge you, which correlates perfectly with the fact that the sheep and the goats will be separated. The nations are going to be judged based on the criteria that we've collectively agreed to and enshrined and established in the Universal Declaration of the Human Rights. The nations have declared this is how we're going to be judged. And in fact, it is how we're being judged as a species. And, the turbulence and the revolutions that come from populations who are not receiving those essential human rights, right, is the judgment upon those nations, whether they're excelling. So to the point about the laws that were put in place that deliver those snowflakes consistently and uniquely, I'm inspired further in this view that this is the evolution of a system that was set in place, hundreds of billions of years ago, to ultimately end up at this evolutionary stage where we as a species are striving to achieve those high and lofty goals in some way. So yeah, I'm very optimistic about that as well, though it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and with a lot of pain in the process.
Well, that's how you learn. I mean, you don't learn to walk without falling. I think even probably Jesus went through that phase. So, I think that, this is the truth. It's interesting that, if you look at the world's religions, which formed completely independent of each other in many ways, there's been a lot of mixing, of course, but if you look at individual religions as they developed, completely separate from one another, there are certain truths that come out. The Native Americans, I believe the Sioux in the South Dakota area, believed that God was at the center of an incredible circle, and all the religions of the world were on the outside of that circle pointing in to God. And I think if you look at the universal truths that we see in these religions, these are people's creations to understand the universe, whether they're true, that they, whether Jesus really said these exact things, or whether this was the intent behind what he was saying, or the intent of the people who were spreading the gospel, whatever. Even if you take that away, you look at all the different religions, they all come down to very simple, very consistent messages. And those are messages of compassion and love, to love your fellow man and to be of service to your fellow man. That pervades all these religions that developed independently, which tells me that within the human condition, baked into our DNA, is the desire to be kind and the desire to grow as a person by helping other people. And one of the things I always stress to people I work with is, being kind doesn't have to be a big, huge capital K, where you are doing, you're paying somebody's student loans off or something like this. It's the little kindnesses that add up over time. And that's the beauty of what we as a species can be capable of. The individuals may not ever achieve that. And it is sad to me for people who have unrealized spirituality, because I think that it is it's a tough road if you're not able to find spirituality. I know I've hoed that road, and it was not a beautiful, wonderful thing. And I also honestly believe that only a few people really ever get lucky enough to find that peace that you and I and Jacqueline are talking about tonight. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
I wanted to show just one more comment, which will be a lead into showing also a few more of your photos to wrap this up. And we're definitely going to try to drag you back here, whether you want to come or not. I thought this was a nice poetic comment. And Jacqueline, whether it was one of the ones we showed or one of the ones that we didn't, we're gonna show some pictures, go to a commercial break, and then come back and have you announce the winner of the Comment of the Night Award. And any last comments from you, Jason, at that point? And we'll also give a quick, tiny peek into next week's show. So, Dan,
I want to come back to some of those comments after the break, for sure.
Great. Awesome. Dan, if you want to go ahead and show those pictures. And Jason, if you have any comments about what these are.
Yeah, this is the Aurora Borealis on Christmas night up in Iceland. And I'd never seen it before. And the picture doesn't capture the fact that it was from horizon to horizon. And it was dancing. It was just spiritual is the right word for that moment.
Well, what it does bring awe and wonder, but it also makes me want to find somebody and stand under that mistletoe.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There were kisses to be had, for sure. And this is kind of cool. This is what we call a land spout tornado. These tend to mimic water spouts, and they're mechanistically similar. I just love the little dancing prairie cyclone. I mean, this is sort of classic Wizard of Oz type style. This, on the other hand, is not Wizard of Oz. This is the potential for significant devastation, a wedge tornado that fortunately did no damage. And that's the kind that I like to chase. But it gives you the idea of both the scale and the spectacle that I get to see when I'm out storm chasing. I love that. And there's another land spout tornado with a 1930s outbuilding that had silverware still there from the Dust Bowl. So that was kind of cool. And that was also in eastern Colorado. And who's that guy? God, he's good looking. Oh, yeah. And there's a tornado in the background, too. So that's probably me.
Well, excellent. We'll cut to commercial break. And when we come back, we'll have Jason commenting on some of the comments and Jacqueline sharing her thoughts, giving away a book, and we'll learn about next week's show.
All right. Cool. Well, this has been awesome. Jason, thank you for being so patient with my questions.
Oh, absolutely. It's actually really great to hear what people's experiences are. It's always helpful for me.
Awesome. And I did find a screenshot of that dog. So if you can help
Please, that'd be great. Send it to me.
What it looks like, it's the people who got ill in the period of study, and those whether they never, rarely, or sometimes, often, or always wore a cloth covering. And it was people with cloth covering with the highest number of people who got
that
sick.
actually is true. The regular cloth coverings were not effective. That is 100% correct. And that's because they would trap moisture, and the moisture is exactly what COVID loved to move from one place to another. You're correct.
Right.
So you are 100% correct.
Do you travel to capture these celestial phenomena with your camera?
Yes. Yeah. For example, I'm looking forward to, I believe it's April 14th next year. I can't wait. Big total eclipse moving through
Land Passes. I live in Land Passes. We're one of the points. You should come to the Cowboy Cliffs capital.
100%. I want to smell your new house and see if it smells like the barbecue that was once there.
Yeah, okay. I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't smell like barbecue. All right. Well, this has been wonderful. I will say the winner tonight is William, who had two great comments. One was looking at the snowflake pictures in the frozen section of the grocery store.
That's awesome,
and,
by the way.
And also, he wanted your thoughts, and this may or may be a question you're comfortable answering, but he wanted to know, given the confluence of all your interests and talents and stuff, and your comment, which religion is the funniest?
Which religion is the funniest? Oh my gosh. Wow. That is I'm gonna go with oh God, I'm gonna offend somebody. I'm sure I will. I saw Book of Mormon. It was pretty awesome. So I'm gonna go with Mormonism only because of that. That was hysterical. Okay. Those are some Colorado boys who wrote that. So that's great. Fair and enough. Patch Adams was definitely the funniest physician comedian behind me. The height requirement, by the way, which you also didn't include in that, the height requirement's very, very strict. The other rule of stand-up comedy, and the reason I became a physician was, you know, when you're a stand-up comedian, you're up on stage and you're the one doing the dying. But now that I'm a physician, though, see, other people are doing that. It's an easier issue. Trust me.
Very good. Well, I hope everyone goes and finds your work. Storm Doctor is your beautiful photography, and also your name, Jason Persoff, on YouTube, if you want to learn how to take snowflake photos yourself.
Absolutely. Reach out anytime. And by the way, thank you, Shabana, for the nice comment about the snowflakes.
Is there anything else you want to tell people about your work, where to find you? Any parting comments before we just share what we're going to get into next week?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Storm Doctor. And you're welcome to come by my website, stormdoctor.com. And, you know, the biggest thing I hope people take away is that this world is an amazing place and we're living in it, and we've been given this gift. So pay attention out there, because it's really wonderful.
Well, thanks you so much. And for those who like Jacqueline and I, and I'm sure Dan as well, listening in the wings, have not heard enough from Jason, we will have him back. Next week, we have quite a fascinating guest. You may recall, if you tuned in, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? We had Imam Mikhail, who was talking about the interfaith library in Islam. And we mentioned that we would have somebody on the show who would like to ask some questions similar to what we did tonight in terms of the vaccines and the messaging around COVID. And you've got people on different sides of it. When it comes to the religion of Islam, it has critics. Criticism of Islam has sometimes led to accusations of Islamophobia, and no one has experienced this perhaps more than a British politician, Anne Marie Waters, who, in addressing certain concerns that she had about practices that are associated with Islam, was targeted and labeled, even though from her perspective, she was seeking to try to improve the situation of basic human rights as established in that charter of the Declaration of Human Rights that we talked about. So next week, we will be having Anne Marie Waters. She is in Great Britain, and the timing isn't such. So I'm also going to announce that we're going to have a new show format with some pre-recorded segments. The show will continue to be live. It's not clear whether we'll be able to have Anne Marie live in the studio to comment on some of the videos, but we will be here to have her response to some of the questions that arise when we start talking about Islam. This is going to be a fascinating show, and it will be the beginning of a dialogue in which we explore the true nature of Islam, and are these criticisms valid? And if so, which parts of them are valid? So we'll be getting into that as we continue to look at the role of religion in society on the Created in the Image of God show. Hope that many of you will return and that you'll share about this show with your friends and others. Please click, like, subscribe, share it out. And we look very much forward to seeing all of you here next week. Thank you very much for joining the show tonight.